Hello, my name is Steve Robinson. I'm the commercial horticulture agent with Pinellas County, and today we're going to do a module on the introduction to entomology. Entomology means the study of insects, but we're going to do a lot more than talking about insects today. And as we go along here, we'll talk more about entomology and additional critters, bugs, that we run across in Pinellas County, Florida. Our learning objectives today are going to learn the general characteristics of arthropods, describe insect development, and by that I mean complete or incomplete metamorphosis, that's a mouthful. Meta means change, and morphos or morph means shape, change in shape. We're going to learn the basic insect anatomy. We're going to describe insect mouthparts and the plant damage they cause. And finally, recognize common landscape pests, and then recognizing common beneficial insects, because certainly all insects are not detrimental. Share a bug story. Describe an encounter you have had with a bug in your yard. Did you attempt to ignore the critter? Did you ignore it or control it? We'll just see which is the right way to go here. Taxonomy is more or less the science and the art of naming organisms in a systematic way, and usually it's done by going through a dichotomous key. Let's say for a flower or a plant, we see there's a kingdom in the upper left hand corner here. There's phylum, class, order, family, genus, and it should say species here next. Well, the same is true for arthropods or insects. They have their own kingdom, their own phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So we see below there our common chinch bug, and we can see its genus name is Blissus, and insularis is the species. And for living in Florida, you'll get to know this insect really, really well. As our program opened, we saw that we're going to be talking about insects, but we're going to be talking about a bigger cross-section of organisms called arthropods. Arthro simply means jointed, joints in the legs, and podo meaning appendage. In some cases it can mean foot, but that's what we're looking at here is organisms that have jointed appendages. That's what we're really going to be talking about here today. So that would include insects, but it also includes other organisms, and that's why we're talking arthropods. Okay, the phylum Arthropoda. It includes insects, like the American grasshopper, mites, myriapods, like centipedes, the crustaceans, ticks, and spiders. So as you can see here, we're not talking exclusively insects here today. We're talking about arthropods, because these can all be issues you'll encounter in horticulture, and to some degree even in public health. The phylum Arthropoda includes insects, crustaceans, mites, ticks, spiders. They all share these key traits: bilateral symmetry, and we'll get into that here in just a second, segmented bodies, paired jointed appendages, a chitinous exoskeleton, they've actually got kind of a shell, ventral nerve cord, and an open circulatory system. Thank goodness for that. Okay, bilateral symmetry. If we had a laser beam or a really sharp razor blade, we could cut this organism in half, and it would be nearly identical in each half. And that's what we're referring to when we see bilateral symmetry. Also, really just early on, look where the legs are emerging from. They're not coming from the head. They're not coming from the end of the insect. They're coming from the middle. And this part of the organism, insect in this case, would be called the thorax. And we'll get to that later on here in just a few minutes. So continuing on here, we see the segmented bodies here in a kind of a cross section. With the insect, we see three definite body segments. We start with the head. That includes the mandibles with which they typically feed from. The eyes, those are all included in the head section. The thorax includes the locomotion portion of the insect. All of the insect legs, would be emerging from the thorax. And then we have the abdomen, which is more for digestion and reproduction purposes. But as we go to the right to the spider, we see it's only got 2 body segments. So it's not an insect, it's an arthropod. And we look at the centipede here below, well, it's got more than 3 segments. It's not an insect, it's an arthropod. So that's why we're talking about the broader context of arthropods today, not just insects. Here we can see a real quick example of the anatomy of the legs, the paired jointed legs. You'll see the front leg is identical to the other front leg, and the middle leg and the back leg. Very, very symmetrical symmetry here we have. They have a hard chitinous exoskeleton, and generally speaking, they shed and renew that shell, exoskeleton, as the animal is growing. They can't stay within it, so it's actually shed off, exfoliated, and the insect moves on. They have a very simple central nervous system. It consists of a very tiny brain, a nerve cord with clusters of nerve cells called ganglia. That's a great word. We'll see that later on today, ganglia. They have an open circulatory system, and thank goodness this makes them quite vulnerable to control, and we'll get to that as well today. There's no veins and no arteries. The blood is held in a dorsal tube or tubular structure with lateral openings in the abdomen. So it's kind of an open system. Okay, now for a quick review of all arthropods and the characteristics that they share. They have bilateral symmetry, they have segmented bodies, they have paired jointed legs, chitinous exoskeleton, central nervous system, and an open circulatory system. Those are all the characteristics that they share. And that's not insects, it's arthropods, which is a bigger group. Okay, part 2, insects. Insects have preceded the human species here by about 350 million years. They dominate the animal kingdom. In fact, it's been estimated that they make up about 60% of the animal kingdom. Millions of species of insects are found throughout the world, and they're the most diverse group of all animals. Pretty amazing. Our friends, the insects. The relationship of insects to humans. Insects can be injurious. They can feed on plants, stored food, wood, fabric, and of course humans themselves, and domesticated animals and animals that we depend on for food supplies and so forth. The beneficial quality of insects is, without them, we probably wouldn't be here. They pollinate effectively almost all plants, not all plants, but nearly all plants. They decompose and aerate soil. They're a biocontrol for weeds and detrimental insects. They're a food source for many animals we require to survive, and they provide products like honey and silk, and of course all the medical attributes as well. Over 13,000 species of insects are known to exist in Florida, and I imagine that number is increasing every day. We seem to be the perfect place to breed insect species and support new species. Of all insects in the world, less than 1% of them are considered to be pests, and that's within the scope of what human beings consider to be pests. Well, only about 1%. That's not a real high number. So looking at the bigger picture, greater than 99% of them are beneficial, or we can just simply exist with them in some level of harmony. Okay, next we're going to look at insect growth and development. And we get back to that word metamorphosis again, the process of change from egg to adult. But metamorphosis does really mean change of shape. Meta, change, morphosis, which would be morph, meaning shape. The process of changing shape. So look at the grasshopper here we have in the left box. We have an adult at the very top 12 o'clock position, and assuming it's a female, and she lays a fertile egg, that egg will hatch and create what we would call a nymph. And the nymph looks very much like the adult. This is what is called incomplete metamorphosis, or some people still use the term gradual metamorphosis. In other words, you don't see a real change in the shape, you do the size, but the shape of the organism of the insect stays virtually the same. It just gets bigger and bigger until it reaches sexual maturity and is an adult. On the other hand, In this little box to the right, we see the adult weevil or some kind of beetle, and assuming again it's a sexually mature female and she's got fertile eggs, she lays those. They hatch into a larva. Sometimes we think of those as like a worm, but it's actually a larva, and that would be the stage when most of the feeding is done. Could be on the roots of plants, could be on the foliage, it just depends. And then when that larva is fully charged with carbohydrates and proteins, it will then go into a resting or another stage called pupa, and from there it will molt several times and evolve back into an adult. And the whole cycle starts all over again. That process is called complete metamorphosis. There's actually 4 distinct stages versus the gradual or incomplete metamorphosis we saw earlier for Mr. Grasshopper. And you see that in the lubber grasshopper here in west central Florida particularly. The lubber grasshopper is a great lab insect to study. Incomplete or gradual simple metamorphosis, the nymphs look very similar to the adults. Look at the mole cricket here. Got 2 eggs, and the nymphs look very similar to the adult. Growth occurs through molting. So the actual shell that we talked about earlier will shed or split or exfoliate, and allowing the insect to continue growing in size. This would include mole crickets, chinch bugs, grasshoppers, definitely aphids, and certainly cockroaches, our buddies here in Florida. And we'll go on from here and see what we've got. Complete metamorphosis, the larvae look nothing like the adults. The larva is the stage that does most of the active consumption of plant material in horticulture. There's 4 distinct stages. You have the egg, the larva, the pupa, which generally is more of a resting stage. It doesn't really do much damage, and then ultimately the adult. So examples of these could be wasp, beetles, butterflies, flies. This orange critter you see here in this picture here is actually the oleander caterpillar. You can see the eggs have been laid on the underside of the oleander leaf. Those eggs hatch and they become this brilliant orange firecracker looking caterpillar. And from there, assuming it's consumed enough material and food and has stored up enough carbohydrates and proteins, it will pupate, which we see in the lower right hand corner. And following that pupation, we have the adult emerging from the pupa case as the oleander moth butterfly. And with that red tip on its rear end there on the abdomen, a lot of times people are very concerned that this is a poisonous insect. Well, it won't sting you. It's mostly a pollen and nectarivore. So it's vicious cycle, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, again, we're going to look at the insect anatomy. Again, we know they have 3 body parts, 3 very distinct body parts, and usually it's always a head, thorax, and abdomen. They have 1 pair of segmented antennae, and they have 3 pairs of legs, usually 1 or 2 pairs of wings as adults. Sometimes none, but generally there are some wings associated with adult insects. So insects versus mite anatomy. Now keep in mind, insects are insects and mites are not insects, but they are arthropods. So on an insect, you have 1 pair of antennae, 3 body regions, 3 pairs of legs, and the only class of arthropods to have evolved wings. In most cases, this means they have the ability to fly. At least most of them do. Mites have no antenna. They have 2 main body parts, so only 2 body parts, 4 pair of legs, which means 8 legs, and no wings. Although mites can fly, they do it without wings, and we'll talk about that later on, how they actually fly without wings. So, here's a praying mantis, and very clearly we can see the head functions mainly for feeding and sensory perception, in particular sight. The thorax is responsible for locomotion. It always contains 3 segments, each with a pair of legs. So the thorax is the region of the body where the legs extend out from and pretty much carry the insect from place to place. The abdomen is mostly an area of reproduction digestion, and excretion. So how do insects feed? Knowing insects' mouth parts and the damage they do can aid in our identification of insects. Plant damaging insects have either chewing or piercing, sucking mouth parts. And I kind of need to add to this, there's also a rasping third party here, and I hope that Teresa's okay with that. So we have chewing, piercing, sucking, and also rasping mouth parts. Chewing mouth parts. Insects tear off, quite literally, pieces of plant tissue and consume them. It is the most common kind of mouth part on insects. Grasshoppers, caterpillars, and beetles. When you see this kind of damage on a plant, unless there's been a hailstorm, you're pretty much going to be having some kind of a chewing insect pest consuming that plant there. Okay, so what we see in this picture here is a plant damaged by the chewing mouth parts of an insect. The new damage, our clue, is skeletonizing from an immature chewing insect. So when you see this on the underside of a leaf where the leaf has not actually been chewed all the way through, it oftentimes represents the fact that a young, immature chewing insect encountered your plant and took advantage of it. It didn't have the ability to chew and tear the leaf tissue at that stage. Here we see another dried up edges of the chewed area. So that can bring on all kinds of physical damage followed by pathogenic damage. So insects can oftentimes open the door for other issues, and it may not look like insect damage initially. Piercing and sucking mouth parts. These are the needle-like mouth parts that pierce plant tissue and they suck out the plant juices, the plant nutrients, and so forth. Feeding damage can be stippling, like we see on the azaleas in the lower left here. Leaf distortion, which is that middle slide where you can see the leaves are no longer their normal appearance. They're distorted, contorted. Fruit damage on the like tomatoes and so forth. And then they can, of course, vector in diseases, in particular viruses. And we talked earlier today, there's really not a good control for viruses. So insects can certainly introduce those to our horticultural site or to an agricultural site. Okay, now we're going to move on to some of the easily seen symptoms of insect damage. Sooty mold. It's one of the mysteries of Florida. People will bring in samples of this and wonder what is going on with their plant. Where is all this black stuff coming from? It makes your plant look as if soot had fallen on it. It attached to the plant. Well, what you really have here is airborne fungus and molds in Florida. We know all about that. Well, when you have a piercing and sucking insect feeding on your plant, the excrements they make have a tremendous amount of sugar or carbohydrates in them, because that's pretty much what plants are doing. When they excrete that material and it drips onto the leaf below them, the air that's full of mold and mildew will start to grow the mold and mildew on the leaf almost like a petri dish. So what we have here is sooty mold that is not the problem, but sooty mold is a symptom that there's got to be some source of honeydew on this plant. So when you start seeing black stuff on your citrus or on your hibiscus or on your camellia, you've got a pretty good idea there's a piercing, sucking insect issue developing there. In the lower part of this slide, you can see where the ants are feeding on aphids and the honeydew they produce. So this honeydew comes directly from the plant through the aphid, and then it dribbles out from the end of their digestive system. Let's put it that way. So when you see this black sooty mold, it's not the problem, it's a symptom of a problem. Does that make sense? Okay, other mouth parts we have in insects would be siphoning. A proboscis acts like a straw to draw up fluids. We would see that also in moths, butterflies, and our buddies the mosquitoes do the same thing. A proboscis. Other mouth parts can conduct what is called sponging. The insects excrete saliva that liquefies the food, like this fly. Then the mouth parts act like a sponge to absorb the food in somewhat of a liquid state or an aqueous state. And we would find this like in houseflies. That's why you're shooing the flies out of your house, so they don't get on your food, so they don't have the ability to deposit their saliva on your food. Part 3, Common Pest and Beneficials. So here we go, a whole nother part 3. Pest, insects, and mites. Okay, now we're going to move on to some specific insects that do piercing and sucking damage. We'll start with aphids. I think the plant in the upper left-hand corner looks to be a zebra plant, and you can see the aphids are all over that plant. As we've talked earlier, aphids tend to hide from their predators. They hide under the leaves so that when it rains or the wind blows, they just simply don't get blown off the plant. Aphids are very fragile. They don't really have a hard skeleton or anything on the outside. They do molt their skins, but they're not very strong. And you can see they've got pigmented eyes, and their sucking and piercing and sucking procedures cause distortion of the leaves, cupping of the leaves, and that honeydew that comes out of the end of their digestive tract will feed the sooty mold. So the sooty mold we saw in the previous slides will tend to form in the presence of large aphid populations, and that sooty mold is kind of the best early indicator. You can see that hibiscus leaf in the center is beginning to show some mold on it, and it is pretty well at that point already packed full of aphids. Lace bugs. The adult lace bug here is attacking some type of Indian or Caroom azalea. You can see stippling damage on the leaf surface. It looks like someone sucked the chlorophyll out of the leaf in very specific places. Those little tar-like spots, those would be the excrement. You can clearly see those with your naked eye. And the adults are clearly visible with your naked eye as well. And these would be lace bugs. You see them an awful lot here on azaleas, and in particular where they're not exposed to much sun, wind, or wind abrasion or rainfall. The populations can really build up when there's not a natural erosive or exfoliation of them. And then we have mealybugs here. Mealybugs are soft scales, and in their adult stage here, they're quite motile. They can move around and spread their young. I think we talked earlier today, you could actually run your finger along this stem. It might be pretty gruesome, but you can wipe off most all of these mealybugs with physical effort, more so than having to rely on pesticides all the time. Scale insects. This is a really interesting group of insects. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see a hand-drawn version of what a scale functions like. They can have either a soft or hard shell over them. This would be, in this particular case here, a larva, and it is piercing and sucking the nutrients and juices out of the plant. And you can see they're pretty well sealed off. Here we have Florida red scale, T-scale, very common on camellias. In fact, boy, it's almost impossible to control T-scale on camellias. Believe me, I know it. I love camellias, and it's a 365-day-a-year event to keep them under control. And we have thrips. Now this is where I'm going to get a little off target and say thrips are not a piercing, sucking insect. They are more of a rasping insect, and our slide set here classifies them as piercing and sucking. Maybe during our discussion we can talk more about this. But these guys have more like a rasping mouth part. It's almost like a router, and they'll go along the edge of a leaf and literally shear off the cuticle and get down into the epidermis of the leaf. They're not really piercing. They're kind of planing off or rasping as they go through the plant. It really opens up a lot of surface area that then allows other pathogens to get into the plant. Very damaging to the plant. And here we have whiteflies. In particular, you would find these on citrus, to a very high degree on gardenias, and they're an egg, larva, pupa, adult, complete metamorphosis life cycle here. We see the non-feeding adult here with the wings, and then the nymphs are these kind of transparent guys here that can move around very, very slowly, and they do all the physical consumption of carbohydrates from the plant. And when you have whiteflies, generally speaking, there's also going to be black sooty mold as your indicator of a really big population. So you don't treat the mold, you use the mold to give you the clue that there's something going on here. Here are some caterpillars we'll look at real quick that are very common in Florida. This kind of red-tipped, red-legged guy here is an azalea caterpillar. If you grow azaleas, you'll eventually see some of these. Palm leaf skeletonizers. The palm leaves have a very, very thick cuticle, and oftentimes when they get through that cuticle, there's just not enough mouth part to finish off all that cellulose. So you'll see they'll skim off the chlorophyll. Then we got the oleander caterpillar here, which we saw earlier, where the adult is a beautiful moth with kind of indigo colored wings with clear white spots and a red scarlet tip on its tail. Then we got the fall webworm. Kind of see those a lot on pecan trees, if you've got any pecan trees in your neighborhood. And to be honest with you, I've never seen a snowbush spanworm, but I guess they're here. And then bagworms of all kinds. Grasshoppers. In Florida, probably our most common grasshopper is the eastern lubber. We also have conehead grasshoppers here as well. But when you see a lubber grasshopper, you're going to know it. They can grow to a length of about 3.5 inches. Extremely powerful. They're kind of a sloppy jumper. In fact, the word lubber kind of infers they're kind of a drunken, lumbering ox of an insect. They don't move real fast. In the early nymphal stage, where they're black and orange, they do move pretty fast. They can jump, but as they become larger and larger, they tend not to do much jumping. They just eat. And you can see them on plants like the eastern crinum lily, Suriname cherries, and so forth and so on. With beetles here, we have the ambrosia beetle, bark beetle. You can see here the bark is actually penetrated by the organism. And these tubes are pitch tubes, and they are a really good indication of a high and very damaging process that's taking place. We could talk about ambrosia beetles all day long, and we don't have all day long, so we'll have to discuss them in more detail when we get to our programming to review this slide set. Remember I said the spider mites can't fly? Well, they can't fly, but what they can do is when their populations get really, really high, they start spinning these webs. This must be a palm tree they're on or something here. Well, when the populations get really high, they'll actually make a little string off the end of that palm frond, and they'll sail on it like a kite, and they can then fly from one plant to the other, not so much with wings, but just using their web as more or less a kite, and they can just move around very quickly that way. And with the spider mites, you can see here, these are eggs, these little crystal balls. Almost impossible to kill those. Almost impossible. Mites are a very difficult insect, arthropod to control. They tend to do really well when it gets dry. You know, our months of April, May, and early June can be extremely dry here, and that's when you seem to see the most spider mite damage. Note the stippling damage you see here on the spider mite damage. Now we're going to move on to the beneficial organisms and beneficial insects, which there are plenty of those. Remember, only about 1% of insects are considered detrimental or economically damaging to humans. So 99% of insects really don't have a role in hurting us, and a large percentage of them really do help to keep that 1% under control. Here we have predators, parasitids, and pathogens. Predators kill and consume their prey. Parasitoids also live in or on their prey, eventually killing it, and they're a very interesting group. And pathogens, which would include bacteria, viruses, and fungus, and nematodes as well, that infect and kill insects. So these would all be potentially very beneficial in managing insect pest problems. For example, let's start with ladybugs. What we have here in this top picture at 12 o'clock is we have the eggs of the ladybug. And assuming we have a female that's got fertile eggs, she lays those eggs and they hatch, and we get this funny looking thing that looks like a Gia monster lizard. Very soft bodied, and that is the larva, and so is the second slide here, of the ladybug. This is when they do all the feeding and do all the damage to the detrimental insects, particularly aphids. So you see the larva stage here, and then it gets ready to pupate, and then suddenly it turns into this funny looking thing that looks something like a ladybug, but not quite yet. And then it emerges from that pupa stage, and then hardens off and becomes an adult. And assuming the adult is sexually mature and fertile, they kind of get together, and boom, more eggs are laid. The cycle goes around and around. I was up in the mountains of North Carolina about 10 years ago, and I was in the middle of one of these situations where the pupa were emerging into the adult stage, kind of on a front porch of an old building, and there were literally thousands of them coming out on a warm spring day. It would have been like mid-April. I had never seen anything like it before. The sky was just full of them. And we got predaceous stink bugs, and these would be what we would call our predators. They're going to feed on insects, and let's hopefully assume on detrimental insects. They have a proboscis they stick into the plant and quite literally lance it and pull out all the nutrients they need from it and move on to the next victim. Probably a pretty gruesome way to go. We have the green lace bugs, which are predators. Notice that their eggs are laid up on these stalks, and they're laid up on stalks because the male green lace bug likes to eat the eggs of the female the eggs of the lace bugs. They prey on aphids, insect eggs, scales, mealybugs, and mites. And they are the most predaceous as a larva, and that's pretty true for most of these predaceous, desirable insects, is the larva stage does most of the heavy lifting when it comes to eating and consuming detrimental pests, or for lack of a better term, insects. Brown lacewings are also predators. They feed on aphids. Most everything feeds on aphids. Insect eggs, scales, mealybugs, and mites. Aphids are kind of vulnerable. They don't have any real protective shell. They can't move real quickly, and generally they don't fly, so they can't develop wings quick enough to run away from these insects here. Both the adult and larva are predaceous, and the eggs are laid on stalks, and again, that's mostly to preserve success so that the adult of their own species, a male, does not consume them. We have the cyprid hoverflies, which are also predators. They also prey on aphids. They kind of resemble bees or wasps, and the adults consume nectar, and they're really good pollinators too. You don't see those too often around here, but they do exist. You got the big-eyed bug, and he's a really good friend to you if you've got a St. Augustine type of lawn, whether it be Floritem, Bitter Blues, Seville. It doesn't really matter, Captiva. They really consume a lot of chinch bugs. They also eat moths of eggs, mites, thrips, and caterpillars. Notice the big eyes on them. That really lets them kind of stand out from any other insect you might encounter. Then we got the minute pirate bug. They're also predators, and you see the same reoccurring theme here: aphids, spider mites, thrips, whiteflies. They do a great job of suppressing a lot of these soft scales. And of course, we've got spiders, wolf spiders, the green lynx spider. You're going to find these in almost any lawn in Florida. A really good exercise on a warm summer night: take a flashlight that's got a really strong beam and take the base of the flashlight and put it right on your nose. So the flashlight sticks out, a foot or so from your nose, and then at a low angle, let that light kind of pass across your lawn, and you'll see bunches of little bluish, whitish specks looking back at you. And what's happening is you're seeing all the eyes reflect back to you, all these spiders, and you'll be surprised how many hundreds of these are out in the yard feeding at night. Predatory mites, they prey on pest mites, thrips, insect eggs, and predatory mites generally move faster than the pest mites. They really have to, or they can't survive. They literally run them down and suck them dry. And then there's, of course, our parasitic wasp. These tiny wasps lay their eggs in the host of another insect, and as the larvae develop, they feed on the host, and the host eventually dies. So we're talking about almost a parasitism going on. And you can see the aphids here are just mummies or shells of what they once were. They've been sucked dry by the parasites that are consuming them. This is also true for mole crickets. We have natural predators for mole crickets in Florida. Finally, here you can see the parasitic wasp. You can see how they parasitize the whitefly larva. And here you can see them going right after an aphid. That's pretty gruesome there. Very, very cool. Okay, guys, we're coming down the home stretch here on insects and arthropods. Let's try to match these insect life stages. Look at that big ugly grasshopper in the upper left-hand corner. That's the adult stage of a lubber grasshopper. And we talked about how lubber grasshoppers have gradual metamorphosis. They look like a grasshopper when they're born. They look like a grasshopper when they die. So number 1 and letter C would be a good match here. Then we look at, let's say, the next one, the green lacebug, number 2. And we remember those eggs are laid on large, long stems so the adult males don't consume them before they hatch. So number 2 and the letter A would match very nicely here. And then, of course, 3 and the letter B would be our match for our lace bugs. So what we're seeing here is gradual metamorphosis. We're seeing complete metamorphosis here in this particular slide. And again, we can talk about that a lot more detail in our discussion here. Match the evidence with the insect. Well, let's see now. We've got lacebug damage, it looks like, here in the upper left-hand corner. So we're going to probably need to come down here and look at that lacebug in that lower right-hand corner. So I'd say 1 and C look like a good match. And then we see aphids on maybe a viburnum or something. That sooty mold's developing. We know there's got to be a piercing, sucking insect there. So we're going to take number 2 and B and match those. And then in the upper right-hand corner, we see an insect that looks to me like a thrip. And you can see that stippling damage on the poor little plant down here in the lower left. I'm not exactly sure what that is. But to me, it looks like 3 and A would also be a good match. And look, it looks like we're pretty close. Okay, part of our job here at Extension is to help you identify the insects. Because if we don't have a good idea of the insect, we really don't have an idea of is it causing a problem. Oftentimes you'll run across insects that are extremely rare and unusual, maybe threatening to us as invasive, and we will actually send those off to Gainesville to be absolutely certain what it is. So you're seeing right here real quick an insect identification form going to the Department of Entomology in Gainesville. We'll help you here as much as we can before we go to that stage. Here's some resources you might want to look at. Might want to write these down. I'll leave this up for a few seconds here. We've also got a bug deck, and I've got a few of those available I can give to you guys. Maybe when we get together, we could have a door prize day, and I can hand out a few of these bug decks. They're really, really nice to have. And that pretty much is going to cover what we're going to do here today. Here's some more contacts and some acknowledgments. And I guess we'll see you here in a couple of weeks, and we'll talk about insects and arthropods. So I'm signing off for now. It's Steve Robinson. I'm the commercial agent in horticulture for Pinellas County.